Welcome back to our journey through Exodus. It's very good to have you with us today. For now, and by that I mean within the limitations of a relatively short sermon, we need to put aside the very real theological difficulty of the sudden deaths which descend upon Egypt on the night of the 10th plague. Instead, we're going to turn our focus once more to Pharaoh. You'll remember from last time that Pharaoh had no intention of seeing Moses again. He had dismissed him with contempt, Pharaoh foolishly believing that he still had some control or power in this situation. But then that terrible 10th plague happens, and we hear there was not a single house where someone had not died. A little later, loud wailing was heard throughout the land of Egypt. Finally, the collective grief of a nation subdues Pharaoh's ego, and with a curt and angry "get out," Pharaoh expels Israel from Egypt. God will be who God will be, and Pharaoh in truth never had a hope against the power and the authority of Yahweh, of God. But then a very, very interesting thing happens in the story. Pharaoh says, "Go." Remember, this is not a kind go, this is an angry go. Go. And then the rest of the sentence is, "But bless me as you leave." What an extraordinary request for him to make. What a telling thing for him to say. Because he's not only asking Moses for a blessing, he's asking all of Israel for this blessing, the people whom he had treated as nothing more than commodities rather than human beings, the ones whom he had treated so cruelly when he could have responded with compassion, and in some instances the people or the families of the people whom he literally worked to death. Those are the people he now asks for a blessing. So that little sentence is really a stark declaration that Pharaoh is making. In his rage, he is in fact admitting that where once he might have been regarded as the source of Egypt's blessings, he now is instead powerless in the presence of Yahweh, of God. And he is the one who stands in need of blessing. Walter Brueggemann describes blessing as the bestowal of life force. I love the phrase. I hope you'll hold that for the duration of today. The bestowal, the passing on of life force. Egypt was familiar with Pharaoh presenting himself as the one who had the power to give life. You remember we said right at the beginning that he would have been regarded as a god. He was the one who could give life, and he was the one who could take it away. But now God, Yahweh, Moses' God, has thrown all of this into disarray. God has dramatically demonstrated that the empire, that Pharaoh, and up to today, governments are not the real life givers in society. When governments cooperate with God's purposes, they can and do often bring life. But governments ought always to remember that there is only ever one true life giver. All governments function as agents of God, the true life giver. So in this act, God has exposed Pharaoh's blessings, the ones that he would dish out. He exposes them as fake. He exposes the reality that Pharaoh doesn't ever, in fact, give life himself. When we look at the pharaohs of this world, we recognize that in this instance, this Pharaoh sucks life out of some so that he can pass it on to others. If anything, Pharaoh is a vampire rather than a life giver. Allow me to make the point again, if I may. We shouldn't underestimate this request for a blessing from Pharaoh, because the request itself is really a confession. And in my mind, I think it's a selfish confession. He's saying to Moses, "I have to let you go now, but the very least you can do in your going is you can give me some of my power back. You can help me restore my image. I can return to being the one who looks blessed and is able to offer something to others. So bless me." In that moment, suddenly, Pharaoh's not half the man he used to be. Yesterday came suddenly. The power to bless now rests not in Pharaoh's hands, that rests in the hands of the slaves. The ability to bless rests in the hands of those who are in step with God's purposes, those who have devoted themselves to human freedom, those who have devoted themselves to destroying the enslavement of others. They are now the custodians. They are the obvious agents of God's blessing. And in this simple request, Pharaoh indicates that he understands that. He now knows that. After this request, the next most significant thing for me in the passage is that Moses ignores Pharaoh's request. And in fact, by the way it's written, it is not so much a request as an imperative. Pharaoh speaks it to Moses as if it's a command. You must bless me. And Moses doesn't deny him a blessing, but neither does he in fact bless him. Moses doesn't acquiesce to Pharaoh's instruction. Although Pharaoh's voice is going to be heard at least once more in this Exodus story, he has now, especially at this moment, become irrelevant. He's entirely impotent. He's exposed for who he really is. Elvis has left the building. Thank you very much, if you like. So Moses wipes the dust off his feet and prepares to travel. I want in this series, as often as I'm able, to kind of keep us connected with the gospel story. And so for a moment now, I want us just to turn to the death of Jesus. And obviously in the death of Jesus, we see many remarkable things. But from our reading from the Gospel of Mark today, we see this one key remarkable thing I want us to pay attention to. And by the way, to read the Jesus story in the light of the Exodus story is a very moving thing. I'm very grateful for that experience in my own preparations. I commend it to you. Anyway, Mark's Gospel tells us that many Galileans came to Jerusalem with Jesus and were present at the cross. But when Jesus dies, it's not one of those Galileans who speaks. It's the Roman centurion who speaks up. And we must notice his rank. He's not a soldier, he's a centurion. He's a leader. In fact, he might have been the highest rank on the hill that day, on Golgotha. He might well, and in all likelihood was, the chief representative of Rome. He was Caesar's presence at the cross. He is, in this moment, that centurion is the Roman Empire. And now look what Mark writes. When the empire, who stood there in front of Jesus, saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. It says, when the centurion saw how Jesus died, not that he had died, it is how he died. The manner in which he died provokes his declaration of faith. Surely this man was the Son of God. In this moment of death, as the blood of the Lamb is spilled, the empire again recognizes where true life is to be found. The empire sees what reality looks like in the death of Jesus. Typically, and when I say typically, I mean I don't want to be absolute, because I think God works in a whole lot of different ways, but typically in God's economy, the power to bless makes its way into the world not through the rich and the powerful and the famous, not through the haves. In Egypt, God endows the slaves with the power to bless. And in the story of Jesus' death, God endows the suffering servant with the power to bless. It's the slaves and the suffering servant who do the blessing. So allow me to make these three, what I hope will be helpful observations for us out of our story today. The first thing I want to say is, if you seek God's blessing, it's better to look down rather than up. If you seek God's blessing, it's better to look down rather than up. We rightly like to say that our blessings come from above, because in many ways that's a simple way of acknowledgement that God is the source of our blessing, and that's where all blessings indeed begin. But though they begin from above, God's blessing usually makes its way into places of suffering and sacrifice and servanthood. In places of suffering and sacrifice and servanthood. My wife Sharon has an unnerving disregard for people who think they are important. I don't think I could ever take her, for example, to the opening of Parliament or to the Oscars, or for that matter, even to a Methodist conference. Because if there are any people there who are accustomed to others bowing and scraping in front of them, they will get nothing from her. I regard this as one of her spiritual gifts. We ought not to be impressed by the powerful. Instead of being impressed around the powerful, we should develop the habit of learning to be humble around the poor and the powerless. We should learn to be humble around the poor and the powerless, because it is typically through them that God imparts his blessings to the world. That's the message of the cross. That's the message of Exodus. A few weeks ago, I worshipped at our Methodist church in the Walmer Township, and I was sitting in the front row of the church as we had invited people to come forward to be anointed and to be prayed for. My head was bowed, but my eyes were open. And so all I could see were the shoes of the people coming forward to the communion rail for prayer. And in that moment, I was almost overwhelmed. You know that sense where there's like a wave of emotion that comes over you. I was almost overwhelmed by emotion as those feet walked past me. It was clear that some of the shoes that I was seeing were fancy shoes worn by wealthy people, the kind of people who might have come to church in a Merc. But others of those shoes were clearly Sunday best shoes. The kind of shoes that are lovingly preserved for days just like that, just for a worship day, by people who can't afford to wear shoes like that every day. These were special shoes for this moment of worship, coming to the table of the Lord. And then there were these other very humble shoes, well worn, stretched, in all likelihood perhaps the only pair of shoes that that wearer owns. But all the shoes were there that day. And I think that that deep emotion that I felt in that moment was the whisper of God's Spirit. It was as if he was saying to me, Rowan, this is where you will find me most easily. In the shuffling feet of the humble. If you seek God's blessing for your life, I think it's better to look down rather than up. The second thing I want to observe from our story today, to bless sometimes requires us saying no. To bless sometimes we must say no. So we observed a little while ago that Moses doesn't in fact bless Pharaoh even as he asks for it. Moses is not malicious, he doesn't curse Pharaoh, but he doesn't bless him. And he doesn't bless him because he dare not. Pharaoh's already proven 10 times over that he's not trustworthy with a blessing. He proved that he was not a man of his word. He's shown that he would inevitably use God's favor. If he was blessed, he would use God's favor to harm and not to heal, to take control and to impose that on others. Because our story does remind us that Pharaoh never repents. He lets the Israelites go not because he sees the harm that he has caused, not because he's sorry for what he has done to the Israelites. He lets them go because he has no other option. And there quite simply cannot be a blessing for a heart like that. The writer of Proverbs says a hot-tempered person must pay the penalty. Rescue them, and you're going to have to do it again. If Pharaoh had been blessed, he would have simply repeated his behavior. Henry Cloud, the psychologist, just as a way of interest, I thought it was interesting, he says that there's been this marked increase in the last, say, 10 to 20 years of adult children living at home with their parents until sometimes the children are into their 40s. And Henry Cloud wonders whether the parents of these children might have come from a generation which has forgotten how to say no. To bless, and we'll define what we mean by that more clearly in a moment, but to bless sometimes does require of us, like Moses did with Pharaoh, requires us to say no. Let me finish with this last observation. In a sense, right at the end of our word, we're going to define what we've been speaking about. But I wanted to end with this, so I've left it till last. The biblical idea of blessing, my third thought, the biblical idea of blessing is life. That's how we would define blessing, certainly in this story. There are a number of ways in which we think of blessing. In South Africa, for example, there's a well-known culture of blessing. There is a blesser, usually an older man, who seeks sexual favors from the blessee, who is usually a younger woman, and in return she receives financial and other material benefits, often quite generously so. In the Christian community, we use the word blessed in all kinds of ways. Sometimes the word blessing is used just as a way of saying, no, I'm okay. How are you doing? No, I'm blessed. Meaning, if you're from overseas, we sometimes use the word lekker. I'm good. There are some who use the word blessed as call it a theological statement. It's an abbreviated version, if you like, of them saying, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. How are you? I'm blessed. It is well with my soul. The word blessing sometimes is also used in the Christian community to describe when we get something for free or for a discount or some kind of unexpected financial windfall. I got 3 for 2 a click, so I'm blessed. We often think of blessing in terms of financial issues. But I find Walter Brueggemann's definition especially helpful. To bless is to bestow life, to give, to impart life. And therefore, to be blessed is to sense, and we're not just talking about life generally, we're talking particularly about God's life. To be blessed is to sense and to see God's life force at work in your life and for the purposes of your life. But the point is, blessing, if we want to define blessing is always about life, the impartation of life, us to God, God to us, life, and us to others. I think it's fine. I think it's fine that we use the word blessing casually in the Christian community. I don't see any real harm in it, even if it's a misunderstanding. I don't see harm in it. But I do want to finish by saying just this. Our Exodus story teaches us that the word blessing is in fact a very weighty word. It's a word craved by kings, but given to servants. Craved by kings, but given to servants. And now let me say to you, the Lord bless you and the Lord keep you. Amen.